and welcome to Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika, and let's get into our very first story for the week. We're 1 week away from a crucial election in the Philippines. Now, incumbent President Rodrigo Duterte is not contesting, although his daughter Sarah is contesting for the vice presidential post. Her presidential candidate is Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. With just a few days remaining, Marcos and Duterte are leading considerably, leaving many worried about what would happen if the pair win the elections. To understand more about the elections and what's happening there, let's go over to Anish. Anish, if you could take us through some of the major candidates and their platforms, in addition to Marcos Jr.
Yeah, so the main candidate that is put up against the Marcos Duterte alliance right now is Leni Robredo. She's pretty much the second, if you go by the opinion poll, she's pretty much the person who has the second most, vote share and or opinion polling in the country right now. At the same time, so if you look at some of her platforms, her platform is quite complex. If you look at the kind of people who have endorsed her, and she is also endorsing, it is like a sort of an alliance of opposition groups. At the same time, there is also certain progressive movements that have, put their weight behind her. At the same time, she has also given support to some of these same platforms. If you look at some of her senatorial slate, where she's going to support these candidates for the Senate elections that will also be happening at the same time.
Okay.
So in that sense, if you look at it, there is a certain coming together that we can witness when against the Marcos Duterte kind of juggernaut that we are looking at right now. But at the same time, it's like a very mixed package. If you look at the certain policies and promises that she has given, which is at some level, there is a certain level of social conservatism, or at least she is more conservative than Marcos' platform. There are some very basic things that most mainstream Filipino candidates will not be supporting. Like if you look at abortion, their stand will be pretty much the same in most cases. And then the economic packages as well, there is a promise to universal health care, but then there are also talks about continuing some of Duterte's policies itself. So you have a sort of mixed package. Even with foreign policy, she has talked about being more assertive. Now, what this assertion might look like is, something that we can only imagine. If she comes to presidency, then that's when we can actually look at it. An interesting thing is, although there are other candidates in the slate, there is a progressive candidate this time around. There is Lady de Guzman, who is a candidate for Partido Lakas Masa. And it is a kind of socialist platform. He's a trade unionist and socialist leader. So it is after a long while we are having in Philippines sort of like a progressive candidate. So this, despite the sort of coming together we are seeing when it comes to the in favor of the Robredo platform, this independent candidacy from a progressive party also has its own, its own set of politics, obviously. But we are also seeing the alliances coming when the two senatorial slates of the two platforms can be seen. For instance, Nery Colmenares, who leads the Bayan Muna party list, is also supporting Robredo for the presidential election, but he is getting support from the De Guzman platform as well.
Okay.
So there is a sort of an alliance coming through in some certain levels.
Also, rights organizations have been raising concerns about a possible Marcos victory should it come. What are these concerns, if you could take us through?
Yeah, so these concerns are kind of looking, if you look at the current narrative that is happening around the Philippines right now, it is pretty much the primary matter of concern, like the debate that is surrounding the presidential elections. So some of these include what will happen to the legacy that Rodrigo Duterte is leaving behind. Obviously, he's term limited, so he will be leaving behind a very problematic legacy. That is, to put it mildly. We are talking about extrajudicial killings being rampant. Thousands have died in his war on drugs and his war on terror. And in those cases, human rights violations have been documented aplenty, if you look at it. And this is happening not during a dictatorship, that it is happening while a fairly functioning democracy was in place. So the sort of extrajudicial killings, militancy, especially from very pro Duterte, pro or anti-drugs vigilantes, has actually affected the civil society at large. And this has created this very unique phenomenon called, that is one of the biggest legacies of Duterte administration, which is red tagging, which is tagging somebody, an opposition, as a front of the banned Communist Party, and then targeting them through various means, and which includes judicial and legal processes, but also at the same time physical attacks on them. And obviously there is the biggest thing that Rodrigo Duterte is living behind, which is the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed through during the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been one of the most controversial decisions of his during his entire presidency, and it actually gives the executive sweeping powers that can actually affect and leave behind chilling effect to civil society mobilization and even grassroots mobilizations. So these are some of the most primary concerns right now, which has taken center stage in the presidential elections. Obviously, other factors are also part of the election debates, but this has definitely been a major concern.
Well, we'll keep an eye on what comes up with the elections in Philippines. Thank you for joining us with those details, Anish. We move on to our weekly COVID-19 segment. As cases rise and fall across the world, there has been a lot of discussion on what waves are and how they influence public health approaches. For more on this, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. So Prabir, in COVID-19 context, what is a wave and how does one differentiate when it is a wave?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because depending on who you're asking, you'll get different answers. But broadly, if we see that what makes it a wave and what is a ripple, of course, is the absolute number itself compared to what the population of the country is, say, or more correctly, according to the hospital capacity, because that's the one which we need to take into account. If there are too many patients coming to the hospital capacity is not there to handle the patients, we have an immediate crisis. This is what we have seen in the Delta crisis in different parts of the world. Also in the first COVID-19 wave that took place all over the world, it's the hospital system that got stressed, and that's when really the deaths rise. So I think the essential question about what is a wave or not is how serious are the cases and what is the ability of the hospital system to handle it. That's what distinguishes in public health terms what is a wave and what is not. What we are seeing right now is essentially what we call temporary changes of outbreaks here and there, which will always be there because of course people are falling ill in spite of the vaccines, number 2, 3, they're falling ill, but they're mild infections. So really are not people who are not turning up in hospitals because of that, but infections are there. At the moment, we are also not testing enough. Test reports are also not being done because a lot of places home testing is being done. Reports don't go in. So this numbers of case fatality ratios, for instance, which seem to be again going high, is because the cases are not, as reported, are low, not because the case fatality ratio is actually rising.
Okay.
So a lot of this data is misleading. I think if we don't see a new variant come up, and so suddenly a new variant will come up, which is coming from some older lineage than the one which is currently extant, which is the Omicron one. In that case, again, we should start thinking of, do we get a wave or not get a wave? And that is something that we have to watch out for. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be doing too much tests for different lineages in different parts of the world, except perhaps in South Africa, which they seem to be doing a systematic mapping of the lineages. So we really would not know unless suddenly numbers start to rise and then we retrospectively check and say, okay, this is a new lineage. So those kind of cautions we must give. But at the moment, the public health system seems to be handling the numbers. Therefore, in most parts of the world, this seems to be at the moment something we don't have to worry too much, but doesn't mean that we lower our guard. So therefore, search for new lineages and looking at the numbers, that still is something that we have to maintain.
Also, a number of new drugs have come out. How easily are they accessible, and if not, why not?
You see, the new drugs, in that sense, let's focus on the antiviral drugs, not the ones which handle serious cases, because that's when you're in the hospital and then there is essentially anti-inflammatory drugs you're given. So the antiviral drugs, a lot of new drugs have come out. We have, for instance, remdesivir, we have Paxlovid, we have molnupiravir. So all of these new drugs, apart from the monoclonal antibodies, and the whole bunch of new monoclonal antibodies are also in the market, they're all patented. They have to be given very early. So it's not something you give in a hospital when the patient is already seriously ill. Because the viral reproduction in the initial phase is where you give these drugs in order to stop it. If you don't give it that, say, in the first 1 to 3 days, then it may be too late to give the drugs, because the number of virus particles in the body is so high that antiviral drugs virtually have no effect. So therefore, that's a window we need to capture. But if the price of these medicines are very high, then it's very unlikely people will take these medicines, or they will be easily accessible for people to take them. Unfortunately, all of these medicines, whether it's monoclonal antibodies, which are even more expensive, or the new antivirals from remdesivir to molnupiravir to Paxlovid, all of them are under patent protection, and they're still priced at a range which is really not of, say, an over-the-counter kind of drug that you can go and buy very easily. You have to think, should I buy this because it's going to make a huge dent in my pocket? So all these drugs, unless we break the patents, and we can do that under the drug laws that we have, the Indian drug law, for instance, drug law allows for this to happen. Almost all countries' drug laws allow this to happen. Pharmaceutical laws allow this to happen for public health reasons during pandemic or an epidemic. Therefore, these patents can be broken. We've gone to WTO asking that these patents should not be enforced. But what we're forgetting is, irrespective of that, we have the ability to do so. Why we haven't done it? That's a big question. Because without lowering the cost of these drugs, they actually will make very little impact. Because by the time you have reached the hospital, you are serious, then these drugs are given, their efficacy is not very significant. So I think that's the problem we have. Medicines, even when they're available, they're not accessible to the people.
Well, thank you, Prabir, for joining us with those details. Sri Lanka's parliament is set to convene on Wednesday amid a major economic crisis and massive protests. The opposition, SJB, has announced that it will move a no-confidence motion against Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, even as there are indications that the Prime Minister himself might step down and a new government might be formed. There is a deep anger against the government of the Rajapaksas and the way it has handled the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Now, Prashanth joins us to tell us more about this. So, Prashanth, what kind of political crisis is expected to unfold?
Right, Swastika. So it's kind of all happening in Sri Lanka right now, because we've seen, especially in March and April, especially towards the end of March and the whole of April, the government has been rocked by multiple series of conflicts. There's been no real, there's been no real sense of direction. The government has completely failed in responding to the demands of the people, and it's a two-pronged failure. On the one hand, there is a complete bankruptcy when it comes to solutions. There are no solutions to handle the vast economic crisis. We'll talk about that a bit later. And there is also a political crisis in the sense that as protests have broken out, and these protests are unique because they've actually kind of transcended some of the usual fault lines in Sri Lankan society. So of ethnicity, of class, of many of these fault lines have been transcended. There's a vast diversity of people who are protesting, and the government has really had no solution at all on how to engage with these protesters and how to deal with these protests at all. So when you look at this two-pronged failure, we see a government which is in complete retreat right now, and this is what is manifesting in what in the news we say today. For instance, recently we heard that Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, one of the most powerful men in Sri Lanka, might, there was this thing that he might step down. There might be a national government that is being formed. Mahinda Rajapaksa himself has denied that he's going to do that. He's saying people still have confidence in me, they'll vote me back, etc., etc. The president is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his brother. So there are signs that he might try to form a national government. The opposition has said that they don't want to do it because they sense that this government is very weak. So right now, and this is also, it's important to remember that one cabinet has already resigned. And this is the second cabinet that we're seeing. So if there is a situation where this government is forced to resign, it pretty much shows that the Rajapaksas and their regime have reached a dead end as far as politics is concerned. So many questions regarding, what they're going to do. The opposition also has been trying to up the ante to sort of raise the intensity of the protests. But it's not exactly that even they are necessarily in control of what's happening, because it is escalated into a mass movement. And the opposition is also sort of trying to orient itself to figure out how they can best make use of this situation. So on Wednesday, as Parliament gathers, there's going to be a vote for the position of Deputy Speaker. That is going to probably give us some idea about how the various political formations within Parliament are sort of orienting themselves around the government. And if this issue of the national government comes up again, if there is any kind of possibility of negotiation, we'll see what happens. A big problem, of course, coming from the fact that the Rajapaksas have, functioned on this notion of completely alienating the entire opposition, and they functioned on the basis of this majoritarian agenda, on the basis of being completely in control. That for a system like them, it's very difficult to engage with the opposition beyond a point as well. And they've been strong men in the past, both Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya. So right now, as they face this kind of crisis, there is also a huge trust deficit as far as the opposition is concerned. So in that sense, complete paralysis as far as the political system is concerned.
Also, if you think about the solution, something that needs to be handled head-on is the economic crisis. Now, the Sri Lankan government had applied for loans to IMF. How is that progressing? Also, the relief packages for the economy.
Right. So, the latest news is that Sri Lanka expects to get some kind of a package within a couple of months. Now, between that, some days ago, the World Bank announced that it would send $600 million US. The IMF package is going to be very tough. Let's be very clear about that. They'll call for debt restructuring. Most importantly, they'll call for austerity. So, for instance, People's Dispatch has carried a story where experts in the health sector are very much worried what an IMF package could mean, because what they'll basically say is that in a country where public health and education are massively state funded, the cuts that the IMF will want from the government will also primarily be in this kind of scenarios, right? So they'll ask for these kind of cuts, they'll ask for austerity policies all across, which basically means that it's going to create a huge amount of social discontent. And right now we have a situation where, of course, big business is supporting the protests, the trade unions are supporting the protests, but as these kind of packages come through, the effect will disproportionately be felt by the working class, by the poorer people, and that really is the challenge that the government is going to face, because on the one hand there is this shortage of food and fuel and basic essentials. Like if you see photos of large number of cars standing outside the fuel pumps, for instance, even something as basic as that. On the other hand, if Sri Lanka wants to get this kind of money, it will have to make these kind of compromises regarding spending and salaries and all this kind of stuff, which is really going to affect the poorer classes, even the middle classes to a large extent. So how the government can actually sort of overcome that social crisis that these policies will engender is really the $100 million question as far as this government is concerned. Because again, here, I don't think they have really an answer. They really thought about it. There have been economists from the left, for instance, who have talked about restructuring the way the Sri Lankan economy is functioning. But those policies and principles are not really on the table as far as the political system is concerned. We know that both the government and the opposition seem to believe that the IMF is a magical solution to everything. So, ultimately the bottom line here is that even if the money comes and Sri Lanka is able to manage, and this government is able to manage for the next few months until the money comes, once the money comes, the long-term implications are going to be even worse. Right. So there's no real, it's difficult to see a good end right now, or a light at the end of the tunnel exactly right now, because what we're probably going to see is more social discontent, larger protests. The protests providing some kind of a space, like all these protests do, for sort of reimagining how Sri Lanka could be, how its society could be, how its economy could be. But whether that will actually reach the political sphere is a big question. So far, we don't see how this could happen. So a lot of challenges ahead, even if the IMF money or the World Bank money comes in right now.
IMF loan is also a tough bullet to bite for
Absolutely.
Sri Lanka. Well, we'll keep an eye on the developments. Well, that's all that we have from our team at Daily Debrief. Do come back and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.